Slang and swearing often top the list of what people want to learn in a foreign language. But is this curiosity actually helpful for learners or just a fun distraction? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about learning Chinese slang. As mentioned in the introduction, this is something that most students seem to be interested in, and more so than learning other types of expressions or other forms of language. When I learned Chinese, I had many classmates and other people I studied alongside with who wanted to learn slang, and as a more advanced student or a native speaker of Swedish, I have also encountered many people who want to learn slang. And this is not limited just to people who don't actually want to learn the language, they just want to learn a few words, and then maybe it could be argued that it doesn't really matter which few words you use, it's just for fun anyway. But this is not limited to just such people, it's also for people who do study Chinese and take it quite seriously. And that's what we're going to do in this episode. We're going to look at the question of learning slang, how to do it, if you should do it, when, how, and so on. First, I want to speculate a bit about why people want to learn slang. I think that matters. And I'm not really interested in people, like I said, who would just want to learn a few words in the language and then they choose to learn something funny. I'm interested in people who do study Chinese and want to learn the language and then also find slang very interesting. I want to discuss the question of why people find slang so fascinating for many reasons, but one of them is that I really don't find it all that interesting and I've never felt an urge to learn some slang or say dirty words or swear words in Chinese, but perhaps this is because I'm a very uncool learner, and there might be other reasons for learning that I haven't thought about, so I'd be curious to hear what you say. I think the coolness factor is probably one of the reasons people want to learn slang. I mean, if being cool is part of your reason for learning Chinese or learning a foreign language in general, then learning cool words will presumably also make you cooler, so that makes sense. Naturally, I don't think that most people who want to learn slang want to do that just to be cool. It could also just be a curiosity about certain types of expressions and colloquial language, and this is of course understandable. However, there are also many other forms of language that don't garner as much attention, and it seems like slang is sticking out here for some reason. Another possibility is that slang is a kind of safety valve. If you're learning Chinese in a formal context, you have a boring textbook, you have to do what your teacher says, and so on, then learning something that isn't in your textbook and isn't in your curriculum might be very refreshing and interesting. It's a little bit subversive and dangerous even. Being confined to a classroom and a textbook is not good for you, even if you're a beginner. This is indeed one of the main pieces of advice I want to offer beginners, namely to leave the classroom and study Chinese outside of your textbook. And then, of course, slang would seem to be a good candidate because it's often not in your textbook, or if it is in your textbook, it's probably outdated already. But we'll get back to that later. So even if I personally don't find slang to be more interesting than other aspects of the Chinese language, I can perfectly well understand why people find it interesting, and all these reasons are valid, of course. I'm not going to judge you and say that if you learn slang, you're a superficial person. I just want to discuss learning slang from a somewhat reasonable and logical angle and see how much it can contribute to your learning, beyond being fun and interesting, if you think so. So let's discuss a few things that I think you should keep in mind when learning slang in Chinese. The first is that there is nothing magical about slang. It's just like other words and expressions in Chinese, except that they are usually very colloquial and sometimes also very limited to specific contexts. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't learn slang, but it does mean that you should be aware that if there are two words for something and one is considered slang and one is considered standard language, you can assume that the standard word will be more useful, used in a wider area, and will also generally boost your comprehension a lot more than focusing on the slang expression. Of course, if you can learn both, that's fine, but there is always an opportunity cost. This also means that the importance of slang increases the more advanced your Chinese is, because you then need different ways of expressing yourself, and you will also be exposed to people speaking Chinese in a wider set of contexts, and then understanding what they say, even if they rely on slang and highly colloquial language, is important. As I just said, Chinese slang can be limited in many ways, so let's have a look at this to better understand why it is that sometimes slang might not contribute as much as you think to your ability to communicate in Chinese. So the first limitation is time. Slang changes much faster than standard language, and standard language is used in wider society, and sometimes there are government agencies that are involved and so on, and these tend to move very slowly, but the way teenagers and young people speak tends to move very quickly. Written language also tends to change more slowly than spoken language, and most slang is, of course, spoken, although, of course, the boundaries here have blurred a lot when it comes to chatting online and texting and so on. The upshot of all this is that slang goes stale pretty quickly. If you have a textbook from, say, the early 2000s and there are some slang expressions in it, they will probably be out of date by now. But the standard language that that textbook contained will probably still be useful and highly relevant, at least in 99% of the cases. Another limitation is that of region. So slang varies depending on where you are. So if you learned a slang expression in Taipei, it might not work in Beijing or vice versa. And even if this is sometimes also true for the standard language, it is much, much more common when it comes to colloquial language and slang. The next limitation is social groups. So slang works differently in different groups, and I've talked about young people and teenagers. We've also talked about people being online, chatting online, and Beijing taxi drivers have their way of speaking, and computer scientists have their slang, and so on. And so learning slang in one context or in one social group doesn't necessarily mean that you will then be able to use this somewhere else. Now, if you want to communicate better with that specific group, I'm not saying you shouldn't learn this, I'm just saying that don't count on it being useful outside of that group. It can also be very hard as a second language learner to navigate the intricacies of when to use what slang expressions and what impact it might have on your communication if you use them incorrectly or in the wrong context. The final constraint on the usefulness of slang that we're going to talk about here is age. We don't need to use Chinese as an example here. You can just think about your own native language, where there are people who use different slang depending on how old they are. And if you're above, say, 30, there will probably be lots of expressions that young teenagers use that you don't even understand. And if you're older than that, it might sometimes feel like young people are speaking a different language. If you belong to this younger group yourself, you can just think about how older people speak. They use slang expressions that you feel are very stale and old and kind of signal that somebody is not in your generation. And if the slang is old enough, it might be that you don't even understand what it means. So the bottom line here is that slang can be very useful for communicating in certain contexts, but it is usually more limited than standard language. This means that you need to be aware of context when using slang, and in that regard it's rather similar to swearing. Swearing is something I want to cover in a separate episode at some point, but in general I strongly advise against learning swear words and using them in Chinese before your Chinese is really advanced, because using swear words in the wrong context can have negative consequences, and as I mentioned, it's very hard as a second language learner to feel when something is appropriate to say and when it isn't. The main point here is that you cannot rely on what you've learned in another language to understand how swearing works in another language. Yes, you can translate swear words, but that's kind of meaningless because swearing is not about what words mean, it's about what connotations they have, what people think about when they hear them and what they associate them with, and so on. And this will take a long time to learn as a second language learner, so you're just better off not doing it. I know I'm a very uncool learner, but I will try to explain more what I mean in an upcoming episode. But let's return to slang and when and how you should learn it. Since slang is so limited to specific context, it makes sense to learn these words and expressions in context. I generally advise against learning words and expressions from lists, and in the case of slang, this is doubly so. Don't learn slang expressions from lists you find on the internet. Beyond the fact that learning from lists is pretty ineffective in general, this also disregards all the information about the constraints that we talked about earlier. Instead, you should learn slang in context. For example, if you watch a movie or read a book or something else where there is context, you will understand who says what, why, to whom, and in what situation, and you can then gradually build a feel for how specific expressions are used. But if you just download a list and plug it into your flashcard software, you don't have this information, and the likelihood that you will learn things that are useless or inappropriate is quite high. Essentially, this also means that I think it's a bad idea to focus on slang as a beginner or maybe even lower intermediate learner, because there simply isn't much material you can listen to, read or watch where slang is common that you can learn from, and you will be much better off focusing on more common and widely used expressions. As your Chinese grow more advanced or you start interacting more with native speakers, maybe if you live in an immersion environment, slang is not very hard to learn if you already know how to speak Chinese. And you don't need to worry about not understanding colloquial language because you haven't studied it. Because once you are in an immersion environment, these words and expressions will be fairly easy to pick up. Maybe there is an exception if you study Chinese almost entirely in your home country and reach a fairly advanced level. Maybe then it can make sense to study slang specifically through movies or novels or comics or something else. Finally, as a way of wrapping up this episode, I would like to mention a few things about the cover image, which has the character Duang on it, which consists of Cheng and Long, which is the Chinese name of Jackie Chan, Cheng Long. This expression, which doesn't really fit in the normal Mandarin sound inventory, went viral in 2015, and that's around 10 years ago now. And there were, of course, many YouTube videos, social media posts, and so on, aimed at second language learners teaching you about this new slang, duang. In the written article on Hacking Chinese, I've included a graph showing how often this word is sought for on the internet, and there is a giant spike in 2015 and then almost nothing. The story behind duang and how it evolved and what it came to mean and how it was used is kind of interesting, and I'll link to an article on Wikipedia about duang. But the short version is that after appearing in this shampoo commercial, it was then used to criticize or to make fun of over-the-top special effects or exaggerated claims online. The reason I bring it up here is, of course, that this word was all over the internet 10 years ago, but nowhere to be seen these days. It doesn't mean that if you were to use this, no Chinese people would understand what you mean. I think 10 years is not enough to completely make people forget or to have a new generation grow up who doesn't know about this. But it is certainly out of date, and you can then think, was it a good idea for a beginner in 2015 to learn this word instead of something else that would maybe have been more useful? The answer is rather obvious. It's almost always more useful to learn things that aren't slang than things that are slang, and this is no exception. However, as we have also discussed in this episode, I don't think that people learn slang just because it's useful. But I do think it's good to be aware of these things, and I hope that after listening to this episode, you've gained a few new perspectives and insights about learning slang in Chinese. As usual, I'm curious what you think about learning slang in Chinese and what your experience has been like. So please head over to Hacking Chinese and leave a comment. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.